Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will about the second module of the Section 1 in the IBMS Digital Registration Portfolio called Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. I will then discuss evidence justification and some ideas for evidence candidate could use in this module. I will finish this video with some helpful tips to make candidates' portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the second module. These are the learning outcomes candidates should be able to meet when they have completed this module. They should be actively applying equality legislation to their practice and understand how their own values, beliefs and biases impact their practice. They should be able to acknowledge the rights, dignity, and values of others and actively challenge barrier inclusion in their practice. And they should take personal action to ensure colleagues, service users, and carers are treated with respect and dignity. When they complete this module, they should come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that they have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. The task is, using specific examples, demonstrate how you apply the principles of equality, diversity, and inclusion in your practice. So let's break this down into smaller pieces. The first part is asking the candidate to use specific examples. This has from their day-to-day practice. What is it they do that relates to EDI? They should give specific examples from their practice. The second part is asking the candidate to demonstrate how they apply. Again, this has to come from their day-to-day practice. The third part is about the principles of EDI in their practice. First, candidates should think about what the principles of EDI are and how they personally apply them in their practice. They should think about how they create fair, respectful, and friendly environment. They could consider equality of opportunity, fair and equal treatment, elimination of discrimination or legal compliance. They could bring in the equity as well, and highlight what the difference is between the equality and equity. Images are pretty good and worth 1,000 words when it comes to explaining the differences. Also, they could consider how they value difference, how they recognize unique contributions, and how they support representation of minority. When it comes to inclusion, they could consider sense of belonging, respect and dignity, accessibility, and participation. In short, to make it a bit easier, candidate could start with what are the principles of EDI, then mention how they apply and demonstrate them in their practice. And then give specific examples from their own practice how they are applying those principles. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. Candidate is asked to describe a situation in their lab when they learned about the EDI. They could consider using their mandatory training as many trusts have introduced EDI into their mandatory training. The next part of the advice letting the candidate know they could use training session that increased their knowledge about the EDI. Again, they could consider using their mandatory EDI training. Or, if they have attended a talk about the EDI, that would be good too. I know I have attended the IBMS's talk about the EDI, which was cool, and is available on YouTube. The next part is asking the candidate to include a reflection on their training session, including how their practice has changed because of that training. This is self-explanatory. They should simply reflect on what they have learned during the training or from a webinar they are using as an example, and highlight how they are applying what they have learned in their practice. IBMS is also offering an alternative advice, which is a description of protected characteristics defined in the Equality Act. To start with this, candidate first needs to find out what the protected characteristics are. They could check out the Equality Act 2010. They should think along the lines of age, race, religion, disability, and so on. The next part of the advice is asking them to include an explanation on how they treat all colleagues with dignity and respect. They could use specific examples from their practice to demonstrate this and also why they are doing it. The reason why is very important here, as it offers the explanation and candidate's understanding. The last IBMS advise is asking them to demonstrate their commitment to EDI principles. First, they should find out what are EDI principles. Then they should think along the lines of ongoing actions, genuine accountability, transparent inclusive communication or training and education, fostering belonging, seeking feedback, acting as and so on. What do they personally do that demonstrates their commitment to the EDI principles? They could consider their regular mandatory training, attending training sessions about EDI, becoming a member of EDI group in their workplace, or watching webinars or videos about EDI to learn more and improve their practice. Now let's talk about the SOPs that need to be met by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is, respond appropriately to the needs of all different groups and individuals in practice, recognizing that this can be affected by difference of any kind including, but not limited to, protected characteristics, intersectional experience and cultural differences. Candidate needs to be able to appropriately respond to needs of different groups or individuals in their practice. Candidate needs to remember that we live in a multicultural society where different groups and individuals have different needs. And the same will apply to their practice. Those different needs might be protected characteristics, intersectional experiences or cultural differences. What does the candidate do in their practice to respect those needs? Candidate could consider responding by inclusive communication, having cultural competence, offering individualized care, avoiding assumptions, creating reasonable adjustments, non-discriminatory approach, conducting holistic assessment, having linguistic diversity, offering various accessible forms of information, having cultural humility, offering adaptable service or reflective practice. The second standard is understand equality legislation and apply it to their practice. Candidate needs to apply equality in their practice. Does the candidate understand the equality legislation? Do they apply it in their practice? Do they know the protective characteristics? Are they aware of relevant legislation? Candidate could consider protective characteristics, types of discrimination, inclusive practice, making reasonable adjustments, recognizing and addressing personal biases, practicing effective communication, taking positive actions, training and education, creating safe environment, or challenging barriers, relevant legislations that are relevant to equality like Human Rights Act or Equality Bill. The third standard is, recognize the potential impact of their own values, beliefs and personal biases, which may be unconscious, on practice and take personal action to ensure all service users and carers are treated appropriately with respect and dignity. Candidate needs to be able to recognize the impact of their values on their practice. Is the candidate aware of their own values, beliefs and personal biases? Do they recognize the impact of those values on their practice? Are they aware of personal biases? Do they treat service users with respect and care? Candidate could consider self-reflection, education, intentional actions, acknowledge bias, self-assessment tools, reflective journaling, evidence-based practice, professional curiosity, online tests that can identify unconscious personal biases, actions like increased exposure to EDI, educating themselves, distinguishing facts from personal opinions, respectful communication, challenging discretion, professional boundaries, and so on. The fourth standard is recognize that regard to equality, diversity, and inclusion needs to be embedded in the application of all HCPC standards, across all areas of practice. Candidate needs to recognize the importance of embedding EDI in all areas of practice. Does the candidate apply inclusion, equality, and diversity in all areas of their practice? Does their behavior reflect EDI principles? Candidate could consider active application of EDI in their practice, adaptation to their practice when needed, reflective practice, challenging barriers and biases, CPD, utilizing resources, webinars or fact sheets available to them to deepen their understanding and align with best practice, areas of practice where EDI should be applied. Those are the standards candidate has to keep in mind when writing their mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidate's choice and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 9 HCPC standards. As the trainer, you need to set some tasks or questions for the candidate to complete that would allow them to meet the standards. If you download the module descriptors for the portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards candidate has to meet by 2 pieces of choice evidence. The first standard is, understand the importance of safeguarding by actively looking for signs of abuse, demonstrating understanding of relevant safeguarding processes, and engaging in these processes where necessary. Candidate needs to understand the importance of safeguarding. Does the candidate understand the importance of safeguarding? Do they know the signs of abuse and are they able to recognize them? Are they aware of safeguarding process and you trust? Candidate could consider protection of vulnerable individuals like children or elderly, promoting human rights and well-being, creating safe environment where people can thrive, empowering people and ensuring dignity and independence, signs of abuse like low self-esteem, self-blame, presence of any physical evidence of abuse, verbal abuse or isolation, safeguarding processes like the recognition or the abuse, your response, protection and reporting of the abuse, recording, reviewing and learning. To improve future practice. The second standard is respect and uphold the rights, dignity, values, and autonomy of service users, including their role in the assessment, diagnostic, treatment or therapeutic process. Candidate needs to be able to respect the rights of service users. Does the candidate respect rights, values, and dignity of users? Do they act respectfully? Do they treat each service user as an individual? Candidate could consider seeking consent, communicating clearly and respectfully, actively listen to the service users, respecting and maintaining privacy, involving the users in their care, offering choices where possible and respecting visions, respecting personal space and belongings when they deal with service users, thinking about person-centered care, confidentiality, and so on. The third standard is recognize that relationships with service users, carers, and others should be based on mutual respect and trust, maintaining high standards of care in all circumstances. Candidate needs to be able to base their relationships with service users on respect and trust. Does the candidate recognizes the importance of trust when it comes to relationships with service users? Do they always provide high standard of care? Do they treat service users with respect? Candidate could consider collaboration, reliability, maintaining professional boundaries, building trust, empowering others, and supporting independence, focusing on person-centered care, communicating clearly and effectively, addressing power imbalance, promote honesty, practice confidentiality, build trust, be non-judgmental. The fourth standard is recognize the power imbalance which comes with being a healthcare professional, and ensure they do not abuse this for personal gain. Candidate needs to be able to understand the power imbalance between healthcare professional and service user. Does the candidate recognizes the power imbalance? Do their actions ensure this balance is not abused? Candidate could consider their position, knowledge, understanding of service user's situation, access to sensitive information, vulnerability of the service user, respecting confidentiality, setting clear boundaries, focus on service users' needs, adherence to professional codes of conduct, act within the scope of professional, avoiding personal gains such as financial gains, personal gains, or gifts. The fifth standard is understand the duty to make reasonable adjustments in practice and be able to make and support reasonable adjustments in theirs and others' practice. Candidate needs to be able to make reasonable adjustments. Can the candidate adjust their practice to support others? Can they identify barriers and make reasonable adjustments? Candidate could consider legal changes, adaptations, or support measures, reasons for reasonable adjustments, equal access to work, services, and education, the legal and ethical duty of professionals to remove barriers, Equality Act 2010, identify barriers, introduce changes to support disadvantaged people, policies that penalize chronically ill or neurodivergent individuals, buildings that prevent disabled individuals from accessing service, and information provided in various forms. To enable accessibility, ways changes can be implemented like flexible working, use of adjustable desks, dedicated quiet rooms, use of braille interpreters to support individuals with hearing difficulties, installing ramps to improve access for physically impaired and so on. The sixth standard is recognize the characteristics and consequences of barriers to inclusion, including for socially isolated groups. Candidate needs to be able to recognize characteristics and consequences of barriers. Is the candidate able to recognize consequences of barriers? Do they recognize the characteristics of barriers? Are their actions enabling everyone to fully participating in the society? Do they challenge those barriers? Candidate could consider barriers such as lack of resources, physical, financial, institutional barriers, or barriers in communication, organizational barriers, attitudinal barriers, or social barriers. Consequences like social isolation, reduced opportunities, loss of trust, health problems, stigma, economic disadvantage, loneliness. Noticing that not having multilingual documents is a communication barrier, lack of wheelchair access is a physical barrier. The seventh standard is actively challenge these barriers, supporting the implementation of change wherever possible. Candidate needs to be able to actively challenge barriers. Does the candidate actively challenges barriers? Do they support implementation of changes to minimize barriers? Candidate could consider challenging assumption biases, evaluating decisions to ensure they are based on facts not biases, ensuring accessibility of service to all, using inclusive language to involve others, fostering accountability, auditing to identify gaps in representation and creating action plans to address imbalance, speaking up for others and so on, training, lead by example, monitoring, evaluation of changes, transparency, or peer support. The eighth standard is work with service users and/or their carers to facilitate the service user's preferred role in decision-making, and provide service users and carers with the information they may need where appropriate. Candidate needs to be able to provide service users relevant information when working with them. Does the candidate provide relevant information to service users? Do they follow service users' preferred role in decision-making? Do they respect service users' decisions? Candidate could consider respecting autonomy and choice, using effective communication to ensure understanding, encouraging dialogue to involve the service users, share information that is relevant so they understand their options, empowering the service users to make informed decision, using collaborative manner to ensure service users are at the center of their own care, respecting decisions or choices made by service users, even if they go against candidates' professional recommendations. Maintaining confidentiality to protect the service users and practicing honesty as it builds trust. The ninth standard is identify their own leadership qualities, behaviors, and approaches, taking into account the importance of equality, diversity, and inclusion. Candidate needs to be able to identify their leadership style. Does the candidate demonstrates good leadership behaviors? Is their leadership style reflecting ED? Is their leadership affecting service users in a positive way? Candidate could consider leadership qualities like integrity, authenticity, self-awareness, resilience, courage, learning agility, or emotional intelligence, leadership behaviors like empowering others, even minority, to reach their potential, clear communication to maintain an open dialogue, decision-making and accountability to make tough choices, inspiring others with enthusiasm and passion, or building relationships to foster trust and inclusivity, leadership approaches like situational, transformational, transactional, servant, or democratic leadership. Those are the standards you have to keep in mind when you are creating questions or selecting tasks for the candidate to complete, as they all have to be met by the two pieces of choice evidence. One more thing that candidate has to include when choosing and writing their evidence, and that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want the candidate to do that piece of evidence. Ask the candidate to read IBMS justifications, as this can form the basis for how they should be justifying their choice of evidence. They should also include which specific standards were met in each evidence. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as your choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good, and can meet several standards, which is what you need and want. And these are some examples of evidence types worth considering for this section as well. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make candidates' portfolio look really good. Ask them to try and present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs, or even videos, if they can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in portfolios. Ask them to try and make it a little bit more interesting for the reader, which will be you, the training officer, and eventually the verifier. Ask them to try to put themselves in your shoes. How would they like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share my evidence I used for this module, back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also ask them to try and use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each module. They could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of them performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and indication evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Ask them to try and bring in their personality. Ask them to think about the ways they like to learn best to meet all the standards. And one more thing, ask them to keep the standards in mind when they are selecting their evidence. Good evidence will tick off several standards. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting questions, tasks, and guiding the candidate. Bye for now.